Chapter 21, Echoes Across the Lake, Part 2. As they stood on the edge of the lake, a vast expanse of water stretching as far as the eye could see, Candice and Jarek knew they faced a difficult choice. Jarek looked out over the lake with a troubled expression, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an unusual quiet. "We could try to go around it," he finally said, "but it would mean days more of hunting for food and water sources along the way. The western path doesn't have much in the way of supplies." He turned to Candice, adding, "But if we can make it to the fishing village to the east, we might be able to find some help and get better provisions. If we're lucky, someone might be willing to take us across. At the very least, it's worth a try." The choice was a gamble, but Candice agreed that the village sounded like a smart move, if only to avoid the daily struggle for food and clean water. They started on the path east, keeping the vast lake on their right, as they ventured down a narrow trail that wound through the dense forest. The foliage here was thicker, but the air had a damp, peaceful quality to it, a contrast to the unforgiving terrain of the mountains. After a few hours, Jarek suggested they take a short rest by the lakeside. He seemed pensive, glancing out over the lake with an intensity that Candice hadn't seen before. She sensed there was a story there, some past experience that went deeper than he let on. "You've crossed this lake before, haven't you?" she asked, taking a seat on a fallen log nearby. Jarek let out a long, slow breath and nodded, his gaze distant. "Only once. Years ago. It wasn't something I'd like to repeat. We had a small crew, nothing too sturdy, and the lake, it has moods. Calm one moment, brutal the next. We got caught in a storm that tore our sails and nearly sent us under." He shook his head, a faint smirk of self-deprecation on his lips. "I've learned a few things since then. Not sure I'd take the risk again without a strong ship and a seasoned crew." Candice listened, realizing how much Jarek had seen in his years of travel. He was cautious, practical, and understood the weight of every decision. It made her appreciate his presence on this journey even more. They resumed their walk along the shore as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting golden hues across the water. After some time, they started noticing signs of civilization, nets and fishing equipment scattered along the shore, drying in the last light of the day. As they continued, more signs appeared. Modest boats bobbing in the shallow waters, racks for drying fish, and eventually the outline of small, sturdy wooden houses came into view. As they entered the village, the locals looked up, curious about the newcomers. Most villagers were dressed in practical, earthy clothing, with tools and nets at their sides, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and salted fish. A few of the villagers approached them, eyes flicking between Candice and Jarek with undisguised curiosity. "Are you from Haliriel?" one woman asked, a mixture of awe and wariness in her tone. "We don't see many elves around here." Jarek offered a reassuring smile. "Just travelers passing through, hoping to find someone willing to take us across the lake, if luck's on our side." At that, a few of the villagers exchanged glances, some muttering under their breaths. One older man stepped forward, shaking his head. "The lake's not safe. Those waters don't forgive easily. If you're smart, you'd go around or turn back to where you came from." Jarek and Candice nodded respectfully, but the lack of options weighed heavily on them. After thanking the villagers, they continued deeper into the settlement, taking in the architecture and atmosphere. The village was more advanced than the rough huts they'd passed in other isolated areas. The wooden buildings here were well crafted, with clean lines and solid construction that spoke to the villagers' skill with carpentry. The structures had a functional elegance, sturdy enough to withstand harsh weather, yet with touches of artistry. A bit of carved detail here, a splash of paint there. That hinted at a cultural pride in their work. Some homes had magical generators, likely small crystals or enchanted items that provided a touch of power for light or warmth, though most homes remained unpowered. As they made their way through the village, Jarek mentioned the idea of finding an appraiser for the stones they'd collected earlier. "We could use a bit of coin if we're stuck here longer than planned," he suggested. Candice agreed, asking a passing villager if they knew of anyone who appraised items in the area. They were directed to an elderly woman who was known for her knowledge of rare materials and gemstones. Intrigued, they followed the directions and soon arrived at a modest but well-kept home with a small, tidy garden outside. The appraiser's house was unlike the others, with shelves full of stones and odd artifacts along the walls. The elderly woman greeted them with sharp, intelligent eyes, instantly noting the unusual stones in Candice's satchel. She carefully examined each one, making approving sounds as she inspected their quality. "These are worth quite a bit," she said, tapping one of the larger stones thoughtfully. "I could buy some from you now, though I don't carry enough to take them all off your hands. But," she paused, gauging their reaction, "I could pay you enough for a good deal if you're willing to part with a few of them." Candice and Jarek exchanged glances, realizing that this might be their best option if they couldn't find a way across soon. They decided to hold off on the sale for the time being, but made note of the offer, knowing it might give them leverage if things came down to it. Over the next 2 days, they scoured the village for anyone willing to take them across the lake. They spoke to every fisherman, every boat owner, even some traveling merchants passing through. But the answer was always the same. The lake was unpredictable and dangerous, and none were willing to take the risk without a substantial reason. Resources began to dwindle, and the added strain of waiting and uncertainty hung over them like a shadow. Finally, with no other option in sight, Candice and Jarek decided to return to the elderly appraiser. They knew the stones could at least provide the means to secure their next steps, and with that choice, a sense of resolve settled over them both.